Welcome, everyone, to this wonderful program about a timely topic. And we have two experts who have been doing work in this space for a very long time to help us navigate the reasons for, the arguments against, and the future of reparations. I am so grateful to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights for bringing these kinds of programs to the forefront so that people can be educated about important and timely issues of the day. Krista, is there anything you want to say, or do you want me to start introducing our guests?
You're more than welcome to start.
Okay, awesome. So a bit of housekeeping. I just want to make sure that everyone knows that all comments that I may make or that our guests may make represents the thoughts of the individuals who are making those comments and do not represent an official position of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. So the way we are going to organize the panel is we have the bios of the two guest panelists that you are free to read as they introduce themselves, but we wanted to make sure that we spend time allowing you to hear from them and not just about all of their esteemed accomplishments. Both of them are well credentialed. Both of them have been doing important work and have an impressive background that is relevant to the topic for today. But I asked each of them to introduce themselves in the context of this work and to highlight some of the work that they've done and their accomplishments in this space that will kind of ground their conversation. So I'm going to start with Dr. Dwight Mullen, who has been doing big things in Asheville. When I think about what I might want to do after I've retired from teaching, I'm looking at his accomplishments and I'm thinking there's still a lot that retired academics can do. And so I look forward to being as engaged in the kind of work that he's doing as he has been, and in having the impact that he's having. So I'm going to start with Dr. Mullen. And tell us, Dr. Mullen, what are you most proud of in terms of the work that you've done and are doing and intend to do with respect to reparations?
Yeah, thank you for that. My work, it's actually, it wasn't planned. And I need to say that because it just happened and I kind of went with the flow. My plans originally were that my wife and I immigrated. We moved to Nigeria and we really had no intention of coming back to the United States. But in our studies there, I was teaching and working with the Second Republic. It was on public policy and the inability of the government to deliver public policies effectively to localities. So schools and trash pickup and public health, all those measures still needed to be constructed away from the colonial era where they were deliberately denied to local people. Mm-hmm. When we came back to the United States, my intention again was to be at an HBCU, and that's where I've been educated at Atlanta University, and ended up at UNC Asheville. And while there, I thought it was temporary. So let me just say I was going to, wrote an Africana Studies program, which I'm very proud to have authored. And the individuals carrying that forward continue to carry it really with distinction. But it was the undergraduate research program. It was called the State of Black Asheville. And that has been a highlight of my career, of my accomplishments, I think. And what we did was that it started with Katrina. Mm-hmm. We had evacuees from Katrina brought to Asheville, and they ended up in my public policy course. So I threw out the syllabus, and we decided that I wanted to look at Asheville and what would happen if Hurricane Katrina hit Asheville, who would be in the water, who would be down at the Civic Center, who would not be evacuated. And it helped those students to process what had happened to them. But it also started a program at the school where undergrads kept coming to me about offering that course again. Let's do it again. And it evolved into a study of public policy areas and the subsequent conclusions year after year after year. From 2007 to my retirement in 2018, the confirmation of disparities in every public policy area by race and by gender. And it's that kind of legacy, I think, laid the groundwork for reparations conversations in the city as well as in the county.
And so I'm just so, I want to pick up on something you said that I think is really important, which is that your work was born out of necessity and responding to a real life experience that provided a context for developing responsive policies.
Yeah, you know, Professor, that's right on the money. In fact, the State of Black Asheville, I often parallel with Innocence Projects, where student energies are geared towards saving lives and not just providing for their own educations. And that's what I've done I've tried to direct with the students in the State of Black Asheville, is that what is happening right around us that are legacies and in fact continuations of the Jim Crow era.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yes, and I agree with you. I think students learning in the context of real world problems provides the best education, you know, and the most sustainable kind of education. So
now, I want you to know it wasn't planned. I just,
right.
it just happened.
But you took advantage. You took advantage. It was a teachable moment.
Teachable moment that lasted for 10 years.
A long moment.
Long.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen. We're going to now turn to our other panelist, who is one of my colleagues, Professor of African American Studies here at Georgia State University. And I'm going to ask you the same question, Dr. Umoja. What is it about the work in the context of reparations about which you are most proud and that you'd like to share with the audience as a way of introducing yourself in the context of this conversation?
Wow, I'm gonna list a couple of things because I think they flow together. But I actually was introduced to this concept of reparations decades ago when I was 18 years old. I was doing some work with a defense committee of a political prisoner, and I was asked to escort Queen Mother Moore, who many of you might know. She's considered the mother of the modern day reparations movement. She was one of the biggest advocates during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s for reparations. So after I met her in 1972, when she came to Los Angeles, where I grew up, I would escort her, I would take her to her speaking engagements, and I got to learn about reparations firsthand. From the work I did with her, I became one of the founding members of New African Peoples Organization. And that organization is one of the founding organizations, along with the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa and the National Council of Black Lawyers. They're founders organizations of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, and COBRA, which I continue to be a supporter of. And of course, in COBRA is the main force around the HR 40 bill that just finally made it out of committee after a couple of decades, form a reparations commission to study and to come out with proposals for reparations for descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States. That work got me invited oftentimes on international forums. I've been in at least 3 international forums on reparations, one in Münster, University of Münster in Germany, where I met folk from Africa and indigenous folk from Chile and other places. And when I say Africa, in Namibia, Nigeria, and the person from Nigeria, Professor Mullen, was Chinwezu, who was representing at that time the African Union in their a call for reparations. I've also been at international forums in Venezuela, and particularly in 2018, I got a chance to lecture in Venezuela to particularly African descended community, but other communities around reparations. And currently I work with the Beacon Hills Black Alliance for Human Rights in the city of Decatur that's trying to do what Dr. Mullen and them did in Asheville, and also what people do in Evanston. So I'm a consultant to that committee. And the last thing I want to mention is, like Dr. Mullen, I had the opportunity to teach a course at Georgia State University on reparations in 2020 and this year in 2021. Hopefully we'll do it again, and I'll do it with your colleague, Natsu Saito. We'll jointly teach that course in Africana Studies and in law. To do similar things, to come up with proposals and actions, giving our students interaction in studying policy issues and how reparations can be applied here in not only in the city of Atlanta, but in metropolitan Atlanta, state of Georgia. One of the things to note is the state of Georgia has a Holocaust Commission that annually does work, and this was done by the governor, Joe Frank Harris, I believe, who implemented it. It didn't go through the legislature, but the governor created this commission to make sure, because one area of reparations, and through studying it, I learned, as working with the students or teaching it, I learned through international law, one form of reparations is deals with how your history is interpreted, right? Deals with, are there things that are in the public sphere that's harmful to your history, like those Confederate monuments and things of that nature? And then is there a proper, has your history been erased or denied? And so the Holocaust Commission deals with those things in the state of Georgia in terms of the what happened in Europe in terms of genocide of Jewish people. And so Georgia, was responsible for not only the enslavement of Africans, you know, one of the leading states dealing with lynching of our ancestors, as well as the denial of our ancestors to attend or participate in public institutions. The university that Dr. Washington and I work at, Black people were denied be admitted until 1964. And we still haven't properly acknowledged the folks who tried to attend and were denied the right to attend. There were 4 Black women who were denied the right to attend Georgia State. Finally, they were allowed to attend, but we haven't properly recognized them in terms of, in the estimation of the African descended community on our campus. We haven't properly recognized them. So that's something. So I agree with Professor Mullen. Reparations, you know, we have in our head, it's like everybody getting a check one time, that's it, shut up after that. No, it's a policy, you know, that brings about repair of a community. So
that's a perfect segue, Dr. Umoja, to my first question, which will start the conversation with some common understanding of what constitutes reparations, because I think there are a lot of misnomers out there about whether it is just a check, a one-time payment for what is often characterized as a one-time harm, that it can take multiple forms, and that, you know, it's going to require some skill and imagination for us to create policies that reflect the kind of reparations that achieves the goal of reparations. So I'm going to ask Dr. Mullen if he could talk about what is reparations, what forms can it take, what forms should it take?
Yeah, in Asheville, I've deliberately tried to help steer that conversation towards reparations being understood as the repairing of damage in terms of public policies that continue to be implemented in the city and in the county. And so it takes a very present day look at the effects of when segregation was legal and the law stopped it. But what didn't happen was that de facto segregation continued in the implementation and outcomes of public policy. And so what we're looking at is that as you talk about reparations, the first stage of it has to be, you have to stop doing what you're doing.
Right.
Damage. And so the idea of repairing the damage means that you stop damaging. That is a major first step of it. And that has not necessarily occurred as we look at each of the public policy areas: education, healthcare, criminal justice, economic mobility, housing. Those things are still very much in the process of destroying communities.
Yes. And how, so in the law, when I'm teaching about reparations, one of the things that I ask my students to consider is, how do we calculate the harm? How do we define it? Because as you said, it's ongoing, so it has not stopped. But one of the challenges that's raised against granting reparations is, well, we can't define the damages.
Yeah. And so what we decided here was to look at it, and the City Council and County Commission both have issued formal resolutions to recognize this, is that they've looked at each of the public policy areas that I mentioned: education, healthcare, criminal justice in general, housing and economic mobility. Under housing, it includes urban renewal. So they're actually looking at real public policies that were implemented. And the outcomes are taken by race and by gender. And we do it over time. And in doing so, it gets pretty obvious that these things are by fact discriminatory and causing present harm. So the other thing we've done, and I'm hesitating to talk about reparations for enslavement in Asheville, even though they've taken a major step in digitizing slave records here. And so the deeds in terms of personal injury, we can begin to trace to individual families that still are in the area, or to institutions that were benefited by the enslavement of Africans in Asheville and Buncombe County. We have that paperwork in the works, but I hesitate to talk about that because I don't think that we have explored the full range of damage that was done by enslavement. It's easier to do it with segregation because this is living memory. These documents are in the public record. But for enslavement, it takes much more digging, and we haven't done that work yet.
Yeah. Yes, Dr. Umoja?
Yeah, I was going to say this is why the idea of the HR 40 presents of having a commission to study it. It can't just be a knee jerk, me coming up with an amount. But to the definition, I always like to use in Cobra's definition, said that reparations is a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments, corporations, institutions, and families. So, there are a variety of groups that are responsible for the injury, and sometimes there's injury that happens in specific ways. But when you really kind of break it down to people, and what folks really understand is, if I injure you because I hit your car and you're injured, then I'm responsible to not only repair your car, but bring you back as close as possible to what you were prior to the act, right? And so, it's a general principle, a human principle. And then in international law, it takes place under a couple of different elements. One is compensation, just, to provide some sort of relief from a damage through money, as what they would say. Restitution, which would involve other acts that So when you have groups of people historically who've been given territory, homeland, things of that nature, to bring them back to a position of sovereignty, that's part of reparations. Rehabilitation, to restore community is one. Satisfaction I mentioned earlier, but what Dr. Mullen mentioned earlier, one principle of reparations that people oftentimes forget is measures to prevent the damage from happening again, the atrocity from happening again. And so I mean, it's a big conversation. It does require some study. It does require some research, and it does require, I think another element of reparations we can't forget is that the perpetrator can't be the one to determine reparations, right? The perpetrator can't be the one to determine what that is. So we as a people, and I think that's why it's good to have this conversation, but what I'm actually in favor of is communities having assemblies. We need to have hearings in the community. Another local example that occurred is in Evanston, Illinois, where they created, started with a $10 million reparations fund for that community. And they researched the damage particularly, and it wasn't, as Professor Mullen said, they didn't go back into slavery, but they looked at what's been happening in terms of redlining, what's been happening in terms of housing discrimination of Black people in that area and the loss of Black home ownership, right? And so when they looked at that, then they had hearings in the community, and the community got to weigh in on it. So it didn't just come from top down, but people got to have their voices heard. And so we need to have this process all across the United States. And I think it would be one way to help us deal with some of the trauma
Absolutely.
that we experience as people of African descent. I mean, just thinking of what trauma has happened in communities because of how we've been policed. We never think of that as a reparations issue, but there's, so it's a lot of things that we have to cover with the what's happening in our schools.
Yes, yeah.
What harm has been created there in the healthcare system, public health. So, I think, and so I think this is why the question of reparations, we need to really think about and how it could help heal us as a people and bring about some sustainable change. I think we're at the point where we have to discuss something more than what we've been doing the last, since 1954. We have to look at some new methods to bring about new methodologies to bring us to the point where we feel free and whole as a people.
Dr. Mullen, you wanted to?
I did. It's one of the approaches, and I hope it adds to this conversation that we're doing here in Asheville, is that the complexity of reparations, we're using the model that healthcare workers use in terms of addressing the social determinants of health as all being in combination and in sync to yield this sick person. And you can't treat just one aspect of it. You have to do it in combination with the others. And we've had conversations across silos, so we're in conversation with Buncombe County Superior Courts in terms of restorative justice and the reforming of policing with Buncombe County Sheriff's Department particularly. We're looking at substance use disorder as only one part of our approach to public health. The county has declared it a major public health threat, and in doing so, they're beginning to address poverty and economic mobility and education. As the children go back to school from the pandemic, we're assessing them in terms of their emotional and social growth. And what can be done to further nourish that rather than allowing it to fester into the pipeline for prison. But one of the things I also wanted to mention was that the university is being a center point of our approach to reparations, in that we're using students and faculty resources to generate data regarding, for example, urban renewal. We're doing econometric studies in terms of the property and businesses and homes that were lost during urban renewal to assess a real dollar value on what it is we are looking to be compensated for. But on the other side, in terms of the Black side of the issue, we're finding challenges of capacity. You know, we're building capacity to handle the useful intergenerational wealth building that we've targeted as an objective. And that's a challenge right now. And it is exactly what Professor Umoja is saying, is that our community conversations are ongoing, from front porches to the Civic Center, actually. They're still not at the level and momentum I want them to be, but I think that it's important that they are taking place, that people are beginning to talk about it. In the most negative terms, Professor, I just want you to understand.
Yeah. Well, when I was during my third year of law school, I was in South Africa. So this was during former President Mandela's first term in office, and they were floating the idea of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what was so beautiful about it was that even in the process of defining the harm, and even in the process of defining the injury and defining the perpetrator and defining the victim, there was healing because people were finally able to weigh in. So, you know, these conversations on the front porch and in classrooms and at civic centers and in whatever ways we decide to organize ourselves are part of the reparations process. Yeah. It is a means and an end.
Yeah.
Seeing it that way hopefully imbues us with a little more patience, because it's going to take a while.
Well, you know, Professor, I find that the damage done to our community exhibits itself in these opportunities to participate in these kind of conversations, and you just have to work through that pain.
Yes.
There's no other way around it. You just have to. My issue, though, with Truth and Reconciliation, with the larger community, is that it presumes atonement. And I'm not quite sure if folk are actually wanting to do that.
Yes, and they held hearings where victims got to address directly in a real space the person who was last seen with their loved one that they never heard from again. And it was a painful process. And looking at the state of politics and economic realities in South Africa now, it still is a process.
Yeah.
But as you've mentioned, focusing on areas that reflect the human experience where there are demonstrable disparities helps us to be more strategic in what evidence we need to gather to support the reparations movement, and also how we define what should be in place to mitigate that harm.
Yeah. And part of it is, part of the difficulty of the conversation is not just within our community, but between communities, Black and white, and Latinx and the indigenous populations. It's a very complex conversation. And one of the things I found here in Appalachia is that when we talk about historic realities, white people are forced to consider their grandparents as monsters. And I'm saying to them that it's not a personalization we are wanting to go after, it's an institutional transformation we're trying to go after. And that's a difficult conversation to have between communities.
Yes. And, as I look at the movement around reforming our curriculum to exclude, unpopular aspects of American history, I mean, to me, reparations would include a curriculum that includes everyone and tells the full story of America, how it came to be in this physical space and how it came to generate the wealth for which it is known the world over. Like, how do we respond? How does the reparations movement respond to this attack on truth and you know, under the guise of like CRT, but it really is an attack on truth.
Yeah, I don't want to dominate this, but at all, but one of the things that we've done here in Asheville is we're not being patient with waiting for Asheville City Schools or Buncombe County Schools to transform their curriculum. We've actually formed an African American charter school, the Peak Academy, and we're starting it K1 and 2 to teach ourselves and our own children. And that's how we're addressing that while they are over there discussing what CRT is all about, you know. And that's they do that, and that's fine, because I think that another part of the complexity is doing this in a way that is simultaneous, that we can have our conversations while also participating in conversations that transform those other institutions, both in the community and outside of the community. And that's a necessity that we're doing. But the Peak Academy is generating a lot of excitement here in Asheville.
Right. Dr. Umoja, I know you know about that approach.
Yes. It's a historic one. You know, Queen Mother Moore, who I mentioned, was considered the modern day mother of reparations. She used to say in her speech on it that our people suffer from what she called oppression psychoneurosis, is a term she coined. And she said we have been harmed through a denial of our identity and our history. And so what happens in our schools continues that harm. And what happens when our children are taught that Columbus discovered America, it's not only a harm to our people, it's a harm to the indigenous people to say that there was nobody here. If he discovered it, it denies their humanity. So it has to be a whole change of the curriculum. And folks make it seem like this, and through this whole discussion of CRT that you mentioned earlier, critical race theory, that it might bring harm to, for example, white children, if it's told to them what their ancestors did that was incorrect. So we just want to continue to lie to them, right?
Yeah.
And fill them with mythology, which, you know, again, creates more harm. And then it continues to teach them to deny the humanity of indigenous people, the humanity of African people. I remember years ago here in Georgia where there was some curriculum that was put out on a Georgia history textbook to say our ancestors were brought here to help, you know, and so completely whitewashing the trauma that happened to our people. And so, but we do think that the state is responsible for corrective measures, but like Professor Mullen said, we can't wait for that. So we have to create institutions to make sure our children get the proper interpretation of their reality and their history, our experience. And we could do it like Dr. Washington is referring to. My family has been involved in the creation of a independent African school, Colombo Academic and Cultural Institute. In the past, my children went through programs we did on the weekend, but we have to be responsible for our own history. In fact, even when my children were going to public school, my children actually went to public school, I made sure that they got some stuff. And then sometimes they would, you know, it might have been a problem, but sometimes they might challenge what was being taught if they knew it was some madness, you know? And so, but we have to be responsible for that. And just because we're demanding reparations doesn't mean that we're not responsible for our own repair.
Yeah,
there are some things that we have to do ourselves. And most reparations advocates say that we have to be responsible for our own healing, but somebody owes, you know, and so we at the same time that we do things ourselves to make improvements in our community, we're challenging them for the damage from my friend Molly Davis. The term I learned from him was the unjust enrichment that's occurred through the exploitation of our ancestors. So when we look at disparities now, there's an economic basis to that.
Yes.
So we have to challenge those things. Somebody else, because my people were ripped off and indigenous people were ripped off, somebody else became fat.
Yeah.
And so we need to challenge them on that. So it's the human rights violations as well as this unjust enrichment that we're raising reparations claims based on.
And what do you all think about institutions like Georgetown? I know Harvard did it at a point, Brown University, going back and looking at their own history and creating their own response to some of the things that they discover about racialized behavior that injured and damaged Black folks.
They didn't just go back though, Dr. Washington. People put it on the plate. Demands were made, right? And so we can't forget the role of activism.
Yes.
And so what happened at Georgetown was because Georgetown students raised the claim. What happened at Harvard around them selling pictures of enslaved people without compensating their descendants were brought by those descendants, right? And so whether it's legal action, whether it's civil disobedience or whatever, I argue that we got to bring it to the fore, or whether it's going to city council and raising it through, I think as Malcolm X said, by any means necessary, we need to raise these questions to universities, to institutions, school systems. You know, we still have some streets around here named after Confederates, Ku Klux Klansmen and things of that nature. There's a lot of changes we need to make, but if they're not going to do it, we know this. Dr. Mullen is taught in the Africana Studies program, the one we have here at Georgia State. It wasn't until the students shut some things down that we were able to create it, right? And so the activism is a key part of it, because as I said earlier, the oppressors are not going to just say, "Oh, this is the right thing to do." Yeah, you know, we push the envelope.
You know, another part of that Georgetown scenario is that it's rooted in as if behaviors fundamentally changed. And they didn't. I mean, I look at the campuses today, and predominantly white campuses are characterized by the trauma of Black students who are currently enrolled on those campuses. I mean, you're talking about, it's a fight against the grain to offer Africana studies. The courses that I taught were often received by colleagues in other departments and disciplines in an antagonistic or more than likely neglectful kind of way. It was peripheralized. It was as if this knowledge over here is separate and apart from real chemistry and real biology. And the students are caught in the middle of that if they're in our classes, but they're caught in the middle, you know, and they're experiencing a very unhappy undergraduate experience.
Yes, and that same discomfort extends to the staff and to the faculty who are marginalized in their areas of expertise. I had a colleague ask me, I teach, one of the classes I've taught is race in the law. And he said, well, what do you teach in that class?
Yes.
As if there's a whole different body of law that I would need to rely on to teach that actual course. So we are in a particular moment. We had the January 6th insurrection or tour of the Capitol, depending on one's perspective. And half of the country has a nationalistic and racialized view of who are real Americans. How does the reparations movement advance in this space?
I was thinking it depending on whether you said depending on your perspective. I think it's depending on whether you're a liar or not.
I was trying to be judicious.
I know. Oh Lord, yeah, because it was obvious that was a insurrection, right? It was a revolt, a counter-revolutionary revolt, I would say.
Mhm.
Oh man, but I think at this moment it's interesting. I think they said that I saw some information that at least in terms of HR 40, I think there are 170 people, members of Congress, over 170 who are willing to vote for it now.
Okay.
And so it might be bigger than we think, but we'll see because, you know, it was a long time to get it there. And then, of course, I think some of the changes we've experienced, even though we saw January 6th, I think after last summer with the protests that occurred, I think it pushed some things. Even where you and I work, Dr. Washington, I think some changes have occurred because of the rage of our people. I actually believe that Derek Chauvin would not have been convicted earlier. This is the first time that I saw the prosecutor and the other policemen, black and white, come out and willing to testify against another police officer. And so they were willing to sacrifice him on that because of the people being out in the street and them fearing there would be a reaction. So it's possible. I don't think we can rest on that, though. I think we have to continue to raise our voices. We're going to have to continue to move. Certainly what's happening in Asheville, what's happening in Evanston, the fact that Tulsa was a race before and is covered in national news now.
Right.
So some things are moving, but we have to keep that momentum going. I think the fact that they threw us a bone by giving us a Juneteenth holiday, all of these things show that we got to keep on fighting. It's not that we have to rest, that we got to keep on pushing. Because when I was a child, my daddy told me about Juneteenth. I thought he was playing with me because they didn't talk about it in school. You know, it wasn't talked about in school. It wasn't nothing on TV. So for it to be made a holiday, even though I know some of my friends are saying was nothing, but it shows that they have to respond, and they're responding to, you know, people in the streets, not just black folks, but some white folks too, I must say, and other people of color. So we just got to keep on pushing. And you know, I always think that some people say segregation would have never ended. Some people argued that slavery would have never ended. But, you know, some dynamics occurred and our people moved. I don't think Abraham Lincoln just freed us. I think, you know, I know 186,000 black people fought in that Civil War, and another, you know, 200,000 aided the Union Army. And black folks escaped from the plantations during that time to disrupt the Confederate economy. So we could do some things. I think we just have to be kicking the ball in the same direction.
And I think the point that you're making about highlighting the role that we have in these things happening, because the way it's taught is slavery ended. The way it's taught is Jim Crow ended. The schools were integrated. As if these things would have naturally occurred as part of the evolutionary process. It took traumatized people to further traumatize themselves by fighting back. And that, you know, that is what I think I'm really glad that you highlighted, because none of these things are happening simply because people have had a change of heart.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in fact, if you look within our community to talk about, I was talking to my wife. My wife is a political scientist also, but you know, I was talking to her this morning. We said, you know, in 1830, if you had said in 25 years slavery would be over, black folk would not have believed you. if you had said in the height of lynching, turn of the century, 19 teens, 1920s, that by the time of your children's births, we'd be in the midst of a civil rights revolution that ends segregation, nobody would have believed you. And so to talk about reparations now, I get a lot of pushback, but at the same time, 20 to 30 years, I don't see us living without it. We will have reparations. This will be finished. But on the other hand, you asked about the January 6th thing. For me, it's very consistent with the country's response to our presence. Is that when we have pushed, but when we have decided that enslavement is enough, segregation is enough, there have been significant parts of the population that said, no, it's not been enough. You need to be keep picking the cotton. You need to stay over here in Jim Crow. You need to not be talking about pushing back with the war on drugs and mass imprisonment. There's nothing wrong with urban renewal. This is the nature of change, and capitalism will continue to prosper us all, and we'll lift all our boats. Just be patient and wait. That's been the majority of the U.S. population. That has been our history. Yeah. So January the 6th for me was just a focal point of the resistance that we have always experienced. I mean, y'all remember, you're too young. Professor Umoja, you remember, you
I've been age shamed.
Yeah. Or I have. I probably do, but I'm sorry, brother.
You remember Nixon as a
hell, yeah,
civil rights era?
Yeah, no, definitely remember Nixon. And the strange thing about Nixon was, and I tell my students, affirmative action happened under Nixon.
Yes.
You see?
Because what? People were in the street protesting. He had to come up with something.
Guaranteed annual income. Remember that discussion on guaranteed annual income he hosted? He was talking about guaranteeing annual income and lost that vote by 2 votes.
And Dr. King and them was, pushed the poor people's campaign during that time. So
That's right.
All those things. So no, I agree. That's what I tell them is in our memory, Nixon is this racist Republican, and he was, but the push by the people pushed him to come up with these policies. I have a ad he had I used in my classes where he talked about Black Power, not from the Rod Brown or Stokely Carmichael perspective, but he was saying he was willing to put these resources in the Black community so we could have Black entrepreneurship.
Soul City.
Yeah. Yeah, Soul City. Yeah, yeah, that's right. So we just don't know our own power. And we don't believe in our own power. So part of the reparations battle is something we have to rage ourselves in our households, in our churches, in our community associations, whether we're in a Q or AKA Delta. We got some a tremendous uplift work to do ourselves to make sure the reparations that we get what's due us.
Right. Yeah. And so Thomas asked about the movement in terms of its diversity, right? It's multi-generational, it's multi-ethnic, multinational. How does that assist or advance the reparations movement, the multifaceted nature of it?
One of the things I could say, and I didn't know this until I started teaching the class I mentioned on reparations, women are at the center of the reparations movement, always have been. And so when I mentioned like Queen Mother Moore, when I talked about the organization in Cobra, there was a sister by the name of Dorothy Lewis who had been in Baltimore, had been a key reparations activist. When I think of Adjoa Ayatoro, who was a leader of the National Conference for Black lawyers. It's women who always been in the core and pushing the movement, and grassroots women as well as women who are professionals and leaders. So I think that's an important part. I will say this, and I do think we need more than Black folks pushing for reparations, but it has to be led by Black folks. Particularly reparations for Black people. We have to lead it, but we do need support from everybody.
Mhm.
And so we're not opposed to allies and friends. We want allies and friends, but we have to lead it, and we have to make sure we're organized and we're clear to make sure it's going to happen.
Yeah, the Racial Justice Coalition here in Asheville is kind of that international, intercommunal approach that I think really represents 21st century thinking in approaching reparations, is that they don't see it as a zero-sum game. And that's what's so important about it, is that I think it's been popularized about not having a zero-sum, but we're growing the pie. And that's been the approach, because we find that across communities, there are different skill sets that are available and need to be pulled together to operate effectively. But let me pursue the role of women here just a little bit. In terms of public policy implementation, the more you dig into and generate the data for the disparities that end up being the outcomes, the more we find it being particularized and very important to understand that we have to be very strategic as we address the needs of African-American women, Black women in Asheville, Buncombe County, because you can address poverty and ignore Black women. You see. And so the idea of being very specific about what it is we're looking to repair and to construct. So it's that repair and then construct is facilitated by a very deep understanding of the DNA of racism.
Right. And I've always believed that those closest to the problem should be the ones who are fashioning the solution, as opposed to somebody else telling you what you need or what would make you whole. You tell them where you are hurting and how you are hurting and how you can feel repaired and whole. And so if Black women are part of those conversations where we are defining the harm, defining the injury, then we are going to be represented and affected positively by the solutions. But if not, if the people who are defining the beneficiary class do it in a way where we're not involved, you're absolutely right. They can define poverty and address it, and we can still be experiencing impoverishment.
Yes, that's what we have found in terms of healthcare, for example. While the AMA, CDC have provided guidelines in terms of addressing healthcare disparities, we have found that the maternal mortality rates continue to increase by race. And so we're beginning to address through Mother Love and through doula programs and talking directly to sisters about what it is they need after delivering, while delivering and delivering a baby, you know? Yeah.
So we have several questions from the audience. Let's see. Jill asks, I'm curious about personal and interpersonal acts of reparations. I think this is a great question. And reparative relationships in our own lives, if any, that you could speak to, and what you've learned in those contexts and how that connects with cultural and institutional reparations. I mean, if we start with ourselves, should people be responsible, holding themselves responsible for acting in a way that is consistent with the principles that undergird reparations?
I would say yes. And when we talk about healing, when we talk about, but what's the concept of Ubuntu? I can't heal by myself. I have to heal in the context of community in relationship to others. And so, so part of the whole issue of us building community and strengthening ourselves as a community. I was also taught, the group I work with, we have this thing we call the Umoja circle. And we said we are only strong as our weakest link. And we would form a circle. And then if we kind of emphasize one thing that one of the reparations activists whose ancestor now, Njeri Algani, used to say, I'm a link in this chain, and it won't stop with me. But we have to see ourselves as connected to a community. And if I'm weak, then the community has to lift me up. Maybe I need to go in the center of the circle and be protected by these outside forces. And maybe I need to receive love and nurturing for folk. But I think it's a collective process. I can't heal by myself. You know, that's why in therapy, sometimes you got to bring in the family, or the opposite of that, when I'm hurting, it hurts the entire family, right?
Right.
If I got an addiction, it's going to hurt my whole entire household and maybe my community if I'm breaking in folks' homes and stuff like that to steal their merchandise. And so that's how I see it in terms of what we have to do internally. Reparations is connected to that. Yes, we do need to live that, whether the government or corporations, and we do need to live that and make ourselves strong and whole as possible. That's an important part.
You know, let me add another dimension to it, and this is at a personal level, dealing in a predominantly white community with topics that are striking at the heart of Blackness, and what it is to survive in Asheville. Is that I have found that I trust with skepticism. I bring people into my circle with skepticism, because the individuals who have put themselves forward cross-culturally as assistants and supports are often inconsistent because their experiences don't reflect mine. And so I find them instead wanting to impose their experiences for mine. And that can't be. And so I find myself constantly on guard with people who, honestly, within my community, I don't have to put my guard up for. I think it was one of the issues in Africa. For example, during decolonization, we thought that decolonization would be the end of that type of relationship, when it only transformed it into neocolonialism, and that only transformed it into 21st century extraction. You know, but the point being is that the ends continue to be the same.
Yes.
And that's where my skepticism is rooted, until when I see the ends changing, then I believe the nature of our relationship interpersonally. But interpersonally, I think that I am much too willing to have a friendship and an ally, and I have to guard myself against that willingness. I really have to watch it. I work too closely with the school officials, for example, and so I have to watch the disparities at the end to keep them in line to say, this is what you did. Even though I'm calling you by first name.
So Gabrielle is asking, how can Latino allies, many of whom have experienced, I mean, there has been lots of oppression for all ethnic minorities in the US, starting with the indigenous people whose land this is. So how do we coalition build? How can those allies who have had a different discriminatory experience, but just as injurious, how can we work with them and they with us as we move the reparations agenda forward?
I think we have to have solidarity. I don't think it's just a one-way street. So we have to be sensitive to issues like immigration, and what posture do we take in our community about immigration, for instance. And so I think, but historically, there have been solidarity between Black folks and Puerto Ricans, Black people and Chicanos, Black people and folks coming from Central America. In fact, some of them are Black folk.
Exactly.
So You know,
Yeah.
we just have to look for the linkages and communicate. I think we start there. Look for the linkages and communicate and make sure, always try to make sure that we talk of policy. I don't support the policies that would be harmful to those communities.
Right.
So, and I have to challenge them in my own community. So when I have folks in my community blaming Spanish speaking folk for coming here and taking our jobs, I have to challenge that.
Yeah.
And point out, you know, the history of divide and conquer. So I think it's much important. But yes, it certainly we expect and hope that we would have allies from other people of color, and we should show respect and support for their justice issues too, as they affect each other. Terms of the
Dr. Mullen, would you like the last word?
Well, you know, with alliances, I learned when I was a kid with the Black Panther Party and looking at La Raza and the Chicano movement in Los Angeles, the need to have each other's backs in terms of the relationships with LAPD, for example. And I found that the state of Black Asheville can act as a model for data collection and database policy approaches to particularize the response to the racist implementation of public policies, because we find it different for different communities.
Yes.
So having that data available by race and by gender matters, I think.
Absolutely. I know we're right at 1 o'clock. We're maybe 1 minute over. We could talk for another 10 hours and I've so enjoyed this. It has been enlightening and inspiring. And I am grateful for the work that you all are doing, because even in the process of pursuing reparations, I believe we are healing ourselves and each other. So thank you for your continued commitment to this work. And I look forward to seeing you all soon in person. When you come, Dr. Mullen, to speak at Dr. Umoja's class, I will be there.
I'm looking forward to it.